He threw food at a waitress, expecting silence. Instead, her response not only stopped him cold, it echoed across the internet and exposed him in a way his billions couldn't repair. It happened on an ordinary Thursday night at a restaurant in downtown Dallas, the kind of place where the silverware glitters under chandeliers and the wine list is longer than the menu. The staff knew the night would be difficult the moment they saw Bennett Granger step through the doors. He wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of man who carried his billions like a weapon, swinging them in every room he entered. Granger walked in wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's rent for the year. His watch gleamed under the light, and his presence made the maitre d' straighten up a little too quickly. Conversations lowered around him. Everyone knew his reputation. He had once berated a hostess at a Boston steakhouse until she cried. Another time, he walked out of a restaurant in Miami, refusing to pay because his appetizer arrived 2 minutes too late. Stories like that weren't just whispers. They were warnings passed between servers like survival tips. That night in Dallas, the staff exchanged glances that said it all. Brace yourselves. Alyssa Monroe didn't have that luxury. She needed this shift. At 29 years old, she was working doubles, trying to piece together enough to help her younger brother pay for his classes at Prairie View A&M. She was tired, but she had the kind of quiet resilience you only find in people who have no choice but to keep moving. Granger was seated at a corner table draped in linen, his phone already out, as if the staff's only job was to orbit around him. Alyssa approached with her practiced smile, balancing professionalism with warmth. "Good evening, Mr. Granger. Would you like to start with something to drink?" He didn't look up. "I asked for sparkling water before I sat down." "Where is it?" Alyssa kept her tone steady. "I'll bring it right away." She returned within seconds, placing the chilled glass in front of him. But Granger's eyes narrowed. "Flat," he muttered. "I said sparkling." "Do you know the difference?" A hush fell over the nearby tables. Alyssa replaced it with another bottle, twisted the cap, and poured carefully. Granger finally nodded, but there was no gratitude, only impatience. The appetizers were the breaking point. The kitchen was running slightly behind, nothing unusual for a busy night. When Alyssa set the plate of seared scallops in front of him, Granger leaned forward, his voice sharp enough to cut the room in half. "Cold," he snapped. "They came straight from the kitchen, sir," Alyssa replied, calm but firm. That's when it happened. Granger lifted the porcelain plate, his face twisted with anger, and threw it. The scallops slid across the floor, sauce splattering onto Alyssa's shoes. The crash echoed through the restaurant, glassware rattling on the nearby tables. Gasps spread like a wave. A woman at the next table covered her mouth. A man muttered, "Did that really just happen?" Phones lifted discreetly, cameras already rolling. Alyssa froze for only a second, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Every server has that moment where they weigh survival against dignity. She bent down, picked up the plate, and set it back on the table in front of Granger, her hands steady. Her eyes met his. There was no trembling, no apology, just a sharp, controlled voice that carried through the dining room. "You can buy this restaurant if you want, Mr. Granger, but you can't buy respect. Not mine." The silence that followed was louder than any shout. Granger leaned back in his chair, stunned, his mouth half open as if he'd been slapped without a hand being raised. Around them, forks hovered in midair. Conversations had stopped. The entire room was waiting for his next move. But Granger didn't move. For the first time, he had been challenged, not with money or status, but with words that cut deeper than any insult. And Alyssa stood there, unshaken, the plate resting neatly before him, daring him to try again. But the real storm wasn't in that room. It was about to begin once the outside world saw what happened inside. The sound of that plate still rang in the air as if it hadn't yet settled. People held their breath, waiting to see if Alyssa would crumble under the weight of humiliation or lash out in anger. But she didn't do either. Her voice was steady, her stance firm. She looked directly at Bennett Granger, not as a billionaire, not as a man everyone in the room feared, but as just another customer who had crossed a line. "You think throwing food makes you powerful?" she said, her tone even, her eyes unwavering. "It only shows what kind of man you are when no one tells you no." The statement was simple, but it pierced through the silence like glass breaking. At the table near the bar, a couple exchanged glances. A young man in a denim jacket whispered, "She really said that?" Another diner, a middle-aged woman in a burgundy dress, set down her fork. Her eyes locked on Alyssa with something between shock and admiration. Granger leaned forward, his voice low, dripping with contempt. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" "Yes," Alyssa replied without flinching. "I'm talking to a man who thinks money erases decency." The room shifted. People weren't just watching. They were rooting for her, though no one dared to intervene. A busboy paused by the corner, gripping a tray to his chest, his mouth hanging slightly open. The bartender had stopped polishing glasses. Even the maitre d', usually quick to smooth over any tension, stayed frozen in place. Granger smirked, but it was forced. "You'll regret speaking to me that way." "Maybe," Alyssa shot back, "but at least I'll be able to look in the mirror tomorrow." Her words hit harder than the crash of that plate, and in that moment, something subtle but unmistakable happened. The power shifted. The billionaire who always dominated the room suddenly looked small, while the waitress he tried to humiliate now stood taller than anyone in sight. A woman at the far table quietly pulled out her phone and began recording. She wasn't the only one. A man near the entrance already had his camera pointed discreetly at the confrontation, his hand trembling slightly as he tried to steady it. The quiet clicks of record buttons multiplied around the restaurant. Alyssa noticed, but she didn't change her posture. This wasn't for the cameras. This was for herself. She had worked too many late nights, swallowed too many slights, and endured too many arrogant customers to let this one go unanswered. Granger's jaw flexed as he tried to gather himself. He picked up his glass of water and swirled it, stalling for time. "Do you have any idea what I could do to you? What I could do to this entire restaurant?" Alyssa tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but cutting. "You could close it down. You could fire me. You could throw another plate if that's the only language you speak. But none of that will change what just happened. You showed everyone here who you really are." The words landed, and Granger faltered. His eyes darted briefly around the room as though searching for someone to back him up, but all he saw were diners staring, some with disbelief, others with open disgust. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, Bennett Granger wasn't feared. He was pitied. Alyssa turned slightly, addressing the room without raising her voice. "I came here to do my job, to serve with respect. That's all any of us ask in return. Respect. It doesn't cost a dime." The restaurant exhaled. People who had been silent for the past few minutes now shifted in their seats, murmuring softly. One woman clapped her hands together once, sharply. A man followed with a quiet, "That's right." It wasn't applause, it was acknowledgement. Granger leaned back, his face flushed. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His authority had been stripped away in front of strangers who no longer saw him as powerful, but as pathetic. Alyssa didn't wait for him to recover. She straightened her uniform, took a deep breath, and said, "Enjoy the rest of your evening, sir." Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving him alone at his spotless white table. The silence broke into whispers. Diners bent their heads together, replaying the words they had just heard. The servers who had watched from the sidelines felt a surge of pride they hadn't expected. And all the while, phones continued to record, capturing not just the incident, but the fallout. Because while Alyssa thought the confrontation had ended, the cameras ensured it was only beginning. But once that video left the four walls of the restaurant, the story would take on a life of its own. The clinking of silverware slowly returned, but it wasn't the same sound as before. The restaurant no longer buzzed with polite chatter and background laughter. It carried a tension that pressed against every corner of the room. People whispered as they leaned across tables, trying to make sense of what they had just seen. Bennett Granger sat stiff in his chair, one hand gripping the edge of the table as if holding on to control. His phone lay untouched in front of him, the screen lighting up with incoming notifications. He didn't dare look at it. His face remained blank, but his pride was bleeding. In the kitchen, Alyssa leaned against the counter, her hands trembling just slightly now that she was away from his piercing stare. The adrenaline had carried her through the confrontation, but the weight of what she had just said began to settle on her shoulders. She knew the rules of customer service. She knew billionaires didn't get embarrassed quietly. "Are you okay?" asked Marcos, one of the line cooks, sliding her a glass of water. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed exhaustion. She sipped the water, closing her eyes for a moment. He went too far." Marcos shook his head. "Too far?" "He threw food at you like you were nothing. You did what all of us wish we could do." Before Alyssa could answer, the restaurant manager, Elaine Rivers, burst through the kitchen door. Elaine was a tall woman in her 40s, sharp blazer, clipboard always tucked under her arm. Tonight, her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Alyssa," she began, her voice low but urgent. "We need to talk." Now, Alyssa followed her into the manager's office, a cramped space with a desk, a computer, and framed awards for excellence in service. Elaine shut the door behind them. "You can't talk to a customer like that," Elaine said, trying to keep her composure. "Especially not him. Do you realize who that was?" "Yes," Alyssa replied, steadying herself. "And I don't care how much money he has. He doesn't get to humiliate people." Elaine rubbed her temples. "I understand, but this is Bennett Granger. He has influence. He has power. If he complains—" "He already threw a plate at me," Alyssa interrupted. "That's not just a complaint waiting to happen. That's assault." Elaine blinked at the word. She had been too focused on the reputation of the restaurant, the looming fear of bad press. But Alyssa's words cut through the fog. Assault. That's what it was. Before either of them could continue, a knock sounded at the door. One of the servers peeked in, wide-eyed. "Elaine, you need to see this. People are recording. They're posting it online already." Elaine's heart sank. "Posting it?" The server nodded. "It's already on Instagram." Someone tagged the restaurant. Alyssa felt her stomach twist. She hadn't even thought about the phones. She'd spoken for herself, for her dignity, but now her words belonged to the internet. Elaine exhaled slowly. This could get messy. Back in the dining area, Bennett Granger shifted uncomfortably as more diners avoided his gaze. One man at the next table openly stared at him, shaking his head in disgust. Granger slammed his napkin onto the table, signaling for the maitre d'. "Get me the bill," he barked. The maitre d' nodded but didn't hurry. His politeness was measured, professional, but something in his eyes revealed contempt. When the bill arrived, Granger scribbled his signature, leaving no tip, and stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the polished floor, sending another ripple through the room. But instead of the usual awe that followed him wherever he went, he walked out into a silence, heavy with judgment. As soon as the door shut behind him, the atmosphere cracked. A woman whispered, "Good for her." Another man muttered. Finally, someone stood up to him. In the kitchen, Alyssa hadn't seen him leave. She sat quietly at the edge of the counter, replaying everything in her head. What she had said, what she had done. Elaine re-entered, softer this time. "He's gone." Alyssa let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Good." Elaine hesitated, then added, "And people are already talking. Not just here. Online. You should know this isn't staying quiet." Alyssa nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't panic. She just said, "Then let them talk." Because deep down, she understood something was shifting. What she thought had been a single act of defiance inside one restaurant was about to spill into the outside world. But Alyssa had no idea just how far that video would go, or how fast it would change her life. By the next morning, Alyssa's face was everywhere. What she thought was a private moment inside a Dallas restaurant had turned into the internet's newest storm. It started with a shaky 30-second clip uploaded by a college student who had been dining 2 tables away. The video caught the sound of the plate hitting the floor, the scattered gasps, and then Alyssa's steady voice. "You can buy this restaurant if you want, Mr. Granger. But you can't buy respect. Not mine." The caption read, "Waitress shuts down billionaire throwing food at her." Within an hour, it had 1,000 views. By the time Alyssa woke up, still exhausted from her double shift, the clip had crossed 500,000. People were stitching it, reacting to it, debating it. On Twitter, now X, it trended under hashtag "respect costs nothing." Alyssa's phone buzzed endlessly on her nightstand. She rubbed her eyes, picked it up, and stared at the barrage of notifications. Messages from friends, missed calls from coworkers. Even her younger brother, Devin, had sent her a dozen texts. "Sis, you're all over TikTok. That billionaire guy looks pathetic. Don't check comments too much, though. Some people are weird." She scrolled cautiously. For every negative remark, there were dozens of supportive ones. People praised her courage, called her a hero, said she had spoken for every service worker who'd ever been humiliated. Memes were already spreading, her words printed across bold text, her calm expression frozen in screenshots. Meanwhile, Bennett Granger's name was being dragged through the mud. Business news outlets picked up the story, framing it as yet another example of the billionaire's unchecked arrogance. A Dallas Morning News article ran with the headline, "Venture Capitalist Humiliates Waitress, Gets Publicly Shut Down." Cable talk shows latched on quickly. On a morning segment of Good Day Texas, the hosts replayed the video, shaking their heads. One of them said, "This is what happens when people forget the value of treating others like human beings." In a downtown office tower, Granger sat at a long mahogany table with his public relations team. His face was red, his jaw tight. "This is nothing," he growled. "It'll pass in a week." His head of PR, a wiry man named Colin Reeves, leaned forward nervously. "With respect, Mr. Granger, this isn't going away. The optics are terrible. You threw food at a waitress." There's no spinning that Granger's voice sharpened. "She provoked me. She disrespected me." Colin exhaled slowly. "The cameras don't show provocation. They show you throwing a plate, and they show her saying the one thing every viewer wishes they could have said in her place." Granger slammed his fist on the table. "Then bury it. Get the lawyers involved. Threaten the platforms if you have to." Another PR staffer hesitated before speaking. "Sir, the more you fight this, the bigger it'll get. People are rooting for her. This story isn't just about one waitress anymore. It's become a symbol." Granger glared at them but said nothing. For the first time, the billionaire who prided himself on controlling narratives felt that control slipping away. Back at her modest apartment, Alyssa tried to shut out the noise. She made herself coffee, pulled her hair into a bun, and told herself she had to stay grounded. But there was no escaping it. Her phone kept lighting up, friends tagging her, reporters emailing her, strangers flooding her social media pages. Her brother Devin called her directly. "Alyssa, do you understand what this means? People are talking about you everywhere. You need to tell your side before someone twists it." "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly. "I know, but it found you, and you're handling it better than anyone else could. Just don't let them scare you." Alyssa stared out her window at the rows of cars in the lot, at the morning sun glinting on windshields. She thought about all the nights she had come home from shifts with aching feet, about the rude customers she had endured silently. She thought about her brother's tuition, about the sacrifices she'd made. And then she thought about that moment, the plate, the silence, her voice cutting through it. She hadn't planned those words. They had come from a place deeper than frustration, deeper than anger. They had come from survival. Online, the debate spread further. Some defended Granger, claiming billionaires were always targeted unfairly. Others doubled down, saying Alyssa had revealed a truth money couldn't cover. Journalists began digging into Granger's past behavior. Old stories resurfaced. Unpaid staff, lawsuits, hostile boardroom tactics. The narrative was growing teeth. Alyssa's name, once unknown, was now tied to a viral symbol. She didn't know what it would mean for her job, her family, or her future, but one thing was certain. Life would never go back to the way it was before that night. But to understand why Alyssa's words carried so much force, the world needed to know who she really was, and what she had been carrying long before Bennett Granger ever threw a plate. Long before that plate shattered against the restaurant floor, Alyssa Monroe had been carrying the kind of weight most people never see. She grew up in San Antonio, the oldest of three. Her father worked construction until a back injury forced him into early retirement, and her mother picked up night shifts as a home health aide. Money was always thin, but Alyssa learned early that survival meant discipline. She got her first job at 16, bussing tables at a diner off Fredericksburg Road. The pay was minimum wage, but the lessons were priceless. Patience, grit, and how to smile even when you wanted to cry. By 20, she was already balancing 2 jobs and community college. But then her father's health worsened, bills piled up, and she made a choice. Her family came first. She dropped out of school, telling herself she'd go back one day. Instead, she worked doubles to keep the lights on and food on the table. Her younger brother, Devin, was her motivation. He was bright, ambitious, the kind of kid teachers pulled aside to say, "Don't waste this potential." Alyssa wanted more for him. She wanted him to have chances she had to give up. So, when he was accepted into Prairie View A&M University, she made a silent promise. She'd do everything she could to keep him there. That's how she ended up at Branson's, the upscale Dallas restaurant where Bennett Granger would eventually humiliate himself. It wasn't her dream, but it paid better than most places, and it gave her a steady paycheck with tips that, on a good night, covered more than groceries. Her coworkers knew her as the reliable one. She never called out, never left tasks undone, and always stayed to help close even when her shift ended hours earlier. She had a calmness about her that made customers feel comfortable, but it wasn't fake. She had learned to channel her frustration into grace, to keep her pride tucked away where no one could touch it. But under that quiet strength was exhaustion. There were nights Alyssa came home, pulled off her shoes, and stared at her swollen feet with tears in her eyes. There were mornings she wondered how much longer she could keep going. She never told Devin the full story. He knew she worked hard, but she didn't want him to carry guilt. Instead, she answered his calls with cheerfulness, asked about his classes, his plans, his dreams. In her heart, every long shift, every rude customer, every sacrifice was worth it if it gave him a chance to succeed. That's why Granger's arrogance cut so deeply. For Alyssa, it wasn't just about one plate of scallops. It was about every time she'd been treated as invisible, every time she'd smiled through disrespect, every moment she had swallowed anger because rent was due. When she told Granger, "You can't buy respect, not mine," those words came from years of carrying herself with dignity, no matter how the world tried to strip it away. The internet didn't know that backstory yet. They only saw a waitress standing tall in the face of a billionaire. But if they had known the countless nights she had worked without complaint, the sacrifices she made for her family, the small victories she clung to just to keep going, they would have understood why her response hit like lightning. Back at her apartment that morning, Alyssa sat on the edge of her bed, phone still buzzing. She thought about her mom, who had texted simply, "Proud of you. Don't let them break you." She thought about her father, who had always told her, "People can take your job, they can take your money, but they can't take the way you carry yourself." She thought about Devin, whose future she had built her life around. Alyssa wasn't famous. She didn't want to be famous. But she knew she had crossed a line she couldn't step back from. The world had seen her stand up, and now the world wanted to know more. But while Alyssa's story was winning hearts, Bennett Granger's empire was starting to crack, and his reaction would only pour gasoline on the fire. Bennett Granger had built his reputation on control. In boardrooms, he was the man who never flinched. Investors trusted him because he projected dominance. Competitors feared him because he never admitted weakness. But sitting in his penthouse suite overlooking downtown Dallas, staring at news anchors replaying the restaurant video for the 5th time that morning, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the ground shifting beneath him. On CNBC, a commentator's voice cut through the silence. For years, Granger has been criticized for his treatment of staff. But now, caught on camera throwing food at a waitress, the narrative has changed. This isn't just bad optics. It's a reputational collapse in real time. Granger muted the television, his knuckles white as he gripped the remote. His phone buzzed non-stop with calls he didn't want to answer. He finally picked up one from Colin Reeves, his head of PR. "Bennett, we need to talk," Colin said, voice urgent. "This isn't going away. Our investors are nervous. The board is meeting tomorrow, and they expect you to address this." "I'm not apologizing to a waitress," Granger snapped. "This isn't about a waitress anymore," Colin countered. "This is about every person who's ever worked a low-paying job. They see her as standing up for them. You're the villain in their story, Bennett, and villains don't win public battles like this." Granger paced the length of the living room, his polished shoes thudding against the hardwood. "Then we buy the narrative. We make her look unstable, dig into her past, find something to discredit her." There was a pause on the other end. Colin's voice dropped. "Sir, with respect, if you go after her, it'll destroy you. The internet loves her right now. Any attempt to smear her will backfire. We need damage control, not destruction." Granger ended the call without answering, but things were already spiraling. That afternoon, one of his longtime partners announced they were pausing a deal worth millions. "We can't afford to be tied to this controversy," the email read bluntly. Then came the shareholders. By evening, Granger received word that a group of them had filed a request for an emergency meeting to review his conduct. Words like liability and risk appeared in messages from people who just days ago had praised him as untouchable. In the quiet of his suite, Granger poured himself a drink, the ice clinking against crystal. He replayed Alyssa's words in his head. "You can buy this restaurant if you want, Mr. Granger, but you can't buy respect, not mine." He tried to shake it off, but the sting remained. Meanwhile, Alyssa was living the other side of the storm. Her manager, Elaine, called her into the office again that night before her shift. Elaine looked nervous, as if carrying the weight of two worlds, the fear of losing a wealthy patron's favor and the pride of watching one of her servers speak truth. "I need to tell you something," Elaine began. "We've been contacted by reporters. Some want to interview you here, others are waiting outside the building. I need to know, do you want to speak to them?" Alyssa hesitated. Her instinct was to say no, to stay quiet, to avoid attention. But she also thought about how Granger's team might already be working against her. "I'll speak," she said finally, "but on my terms." The first interview aired locally that night. Alyssa sat in front of the camera, no makeup, no polish, just herself. Her words were plain, but they cut deeper than any crafted PR statement could. "I didn't want to fight," she told the reporter. "I just wanted to be treated like a person. I work hard, like so many others do, and I believe we all deserve respect." That's all it was. The clip went viral just as fast as the original video. Her calm delivery, her dignity, her refusal to turn it into spectacle. People connected with it. They saw themselves in her. Back in his penthouse, Granger watched the interview in silence. His drink sat untouched on the table. For the first time, the billionaire who had built his empire on fear understood something terrifying. He couldn't buy his way out of this. But Alyssa wasn't finished. And the more she spoke, the more the public began to see her as more than a waitress. They saw her as a voice worth listening to. The week after the confrontation, Alyssa Monroe walked through Dallas with a kind of recognition she never asked for. People approached her at coffee shops, on buses, even outside the grocery store. Some stopped just to shake her hand. Others whispered her words back to her. "You can't buy respect." She never pretended to be comfortable with the attention. Fame wasn't what she wanted, but she understood why people connected to her. For years, workers had swallowed insults from people with money, too afraid of losing their jobs to speak up. Alyssa had said what so many wanted to, but couldn't. In one interview, a journalist asked her if she regretted it, standing up to Bennett Granger, knowing he had money and influence that could ruin her career. Alyssa thought about it for a long moment before answering. "No," she said simply, "because if I can't stand for my own dignity, then what's left? Jobs come and go, money comes and goes, but how you treat people, that's permanent." Those words struck just as hard as her confrontation in the restaurant. Clips of the interview replayed on television and online, framed with headlines about courage and respect. Meanwhile, Bennett Granger's world kept unraveling. His board forced him into a temporary leave to reassess leadership stability. Sponsors quietly pulled their names from deals. His face, once a symbol of financial success, was now the emblem of arrogance. He tried to release a statement, written by his PR team, apologizing for an unfortunate misunderstanding. But the public wasn't buying it. People wanted sincerity, not carefully crafted sentences. And compared to Alyssa's raw honesty, his words felt hollow. Alyssa didn't gloat. She didn't post victory messages or attack him further. She kept working at the restaurant, showing up for shifts, serving customers with the same grace she always had. But there was a difference now. Diners treated her with a new kind of respect. Her coworkers carried themselves a little taller. Even Elaine, the manager who had once feared Granger's wrath, told her quietly one night, "You reminded all of us that we don't have to shrink just because someone has more money." One evening, after a long shift, Alyssa walked home and found Devin waiting on the porch of her apartment. He had taken a bus from school to surprise her. "You know what people are saying about you?" he asked, smiling wide. She shook her head, tired but curious. "They're saying you gave everyone permission to speak up, that you showed them they don't have to take it anymore." Alyssa sat beside him, letting the cool night air wash over her. "I didn't mean to start anything," she admitted. Devin nudged her shoulder. "Sometimes the most important things happen when you don't plan them. You just did what was right. That's why it matters." She looked at him, the little brother she had worked so hard to protect, now grown into a young man with his own dreams. And she realized something. The moment in the restaurant wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been treated like less. As the weeks went on, the noise around the video faded into the endless cycle of internet outrage. But Alyssa's words stayed with people. They were quoted in classrooms, in workplace trainings, even at church pulpits. A line spoken in anger had turned into a lesson repeated across the country. And Bennett Granger? He remained wealthy, but he would never walk into a restaurant again without people remembering the night he threw a plate, and the waitress who reminded him that his billions couldn't buy humanity. In the end, Alyssa didn't win money or status. What she won was something far more valuable, the knowledge that she had kept her dignity intact, no matter the cost. And that's the lesson her story leaves us with. Respect is priceless, and no amount of money gives anyone the right to strip it away. If you believe in stories that remind us of our worth, make sure to subscribe. There are more stories like this, stories about courage, dignity, and the moments that define us, that deserve to be told.